Hey guys, welcome back to Clownfish TV. This is Neon, and we're going to talk about the comic book industry and maybe speculate as to why the comic book industry and journalism is in the position it's in right now, which is basically the ethics of comic journalists are being called into question lately. And look, I wasn't going to do a video on this, and I'm not going to go into a discussion about individual journalists or websites or whatever. I'm going to try to generalize because there are only a handful of actual like comic book news sites left. But we're going to talk about a tweet that was put out the other day from a former IGN writer who basically said that they were strongly discouraged by the publishers from giving negative reviews of comic books. Now, we know that's kind of how things work with fan sites, right? A lot of times, or with advertisers even. A lot of times you're given access, and this is widely known, whether it's Disney or video game publishers or whatever. You're given access, and in exchange for that access, it's kind of understood that you're not going to slam the crap out of their products or slam the company for its behavior or anything like that. If you'd like to continue to receive free stuff and merchandise, from those companies, or to be invited to events, obviously. The reason I'm on clownfishtv.com is we do have a website for pop culture news at clownfishtv.com. We do talk about comics sometimes, not very much, not in comparison to everything else that's going on in pop culture right now, because comic books, Western comic books, frankly, are not that important to pop culture in general. And that's going to factor into what I have to say about comic book journalism and why these websites are drying up and all of that. But before we get into it any further, please subscribe for more pop culture news, views, and rants. Guys, over 292, almost 293,000 subs. Thank you so much for the support. We do talk a lot about pop culture. We talk about comics. We publish comics. In fact, our most recent campaign, Crimson Wren, is over $100,000, over $100,000 on Indiegogo, and they need to shut that down. They were supposed to. I wrote them a while ago, and they haven't shut it down yet, so it's still kind of sort of open. But the files are going to be off to the printer here in a day or two, and we're hoping to get those books into your hands very soon. So yeah, we've worked in and around the comic book industry for a number of years. Geeky and myself, I basically quit the comic book industry, the mainstream comic book industry, around 2015 or so. Things were starting to get a little weird, and it was very obvious that things were getting very, very political. And I noticed a change in comic book news sites, a couple in particular that used to be a lot more unbiased. They used to be fan-powered websites. They used to just review comic books and do interviews with creators of all stripes, right? And then as things started to get strange, particularly in the areas where comic book creators tend to congregate, Brooklyn and Portland and San Francisco and LA, I noticed a change in comic book websites as well. The reporting started to shift away from just covering comic books and started getting more and more political, or it was obvious that they were only covering certain comics and certain creators that had certain political beliefs. They started to let social media dictate their content. Twitter was the primary driver of news, and that's true across the board. Like all these pop culture sites basically rely on Twitter to tell them what their opinions are and to give them talking points and to also tell them who the bad people are, so they can drag them publicly, right? So that was kind of going on. And so there's been a lot of discussion lately about a lot of these comic book sites that have been around for a while. Comic Book Resources, Newsarama, Bleeding Cool, the Comics Beat. Now, of all those sites, only one of them is still independently owned. Two of them are actually owned by major conglomerates, corporations. One of them, Newsarama, got absorbed into a video game website because there wasn't enough interest in comic book news to keep it sustainable as a separate entity. They basically just roll Western comic book news into a video game site. So there's a lot of things going on here. And one site in particular, I'm not going to name names, but it doesn't take much to find out who it is. But one site in particular that has been around for a while is hiring, but they're not paying their contributors. And they've been rattling the tin cup looking for donations. And other comic book journalists have been like, hey, don't buy comics, give money to comic book journos. So this is kind of the utter state of comic book journalism right now. And even the websites that you go out to, like comicbook.com, very little actual comic book news on those sites, isn't there? Comicbook.com is owned by CBS, by the way, which also owns, Star Trek and some other franchises, Paramount. But there's very little comic book news on these comic book websites. And I'm speculating that the reason is a lack of interest. Just a lack of general interest. I know in our case on clownfishtv.com, we talk about comics somewhat. We talk more probably about webcomics and manga than we do, Western comic books. If we talk about Western comic books, it's the stupid stuff that Western comic book publishers do to try to stay relevant, or, the attacks on YouTubers by people associated with the Western comic book industry. And I want to be very clear. I am talking about the Western comic book industry. I'm talking about the direct market. I am not talking about graphic novel publishers per se. I am not talking about manga publishers. I am not talking about Webtoon or anything like that, because they're fine. They're doing fine. They're doing better than fine. In fact, we did a video on it the other day where I think it was Deb Aoki, who used to write for some of these sites, actually put a chart out there that said, hey, Marvel and DC globally are like in 7th and 8th place, on the list. All of these manga publishers and webtoons are completely destroying Western comics. The only thing selling less than Western comics are European comics, which makes sense given that Europe is not as large or as populous as America, and that's the truth. I mean, it's just like, in Japan, what's crazy about it is globally manga is dominating. Japan is a very small country. Substantially fewer people live in Japan than live in the US, but globally manga is exploding. So you can't say it's just the Japanese buying manga. It's the manga is eating everybody's lunch. So that's why we don't talk about Western comics very much. So I think what's kind of going on here, and the reason that these sites are dying, is a general lack of interest in Western comics. Because again, I know we've published stories on Western comics, and other than drama, nobody cares. I don't think people are buying them like they used to. I don't think people are reading or talking about them like they used to, unless it's negative. Unless it's just like, my God, can you believe, they made another character gay this week. They just made 2 characters gay last week, and this one's, whatever, swapped out for a teenage girl now. Or that's what they talk about. Can you believe they've got 50 #1 covers for this book? That's what they talk about. So it's not surprising that when these outlets are hiring, they're trying to hire as cheaply as possible, because I don't think they're bringing a lot of money in, especially if they're mostly comics focused. Unfortunately, that means that there aren't a lot of mostly comic focused websites out there. A lot of them have been shut down over the years, or, like I said, consolidated or turned into something else. Comic Book Resources, which was once a fan site, is now CBR.com, which talks about a lot of things, and very few of the things they talk about are actually comic book related. It's more like nerd culture. It's kind of like how comic shops now, what is it, Zach from Diversity in Comics, your boy Zach, what he says, he calls them geek bodegas. And that's basically what these websites have become too. Out of necessity, because people simply are not searching for news about the Western comic book industry, unfortunately. I think there's a demand for it, mostly from retailers, but we don't even know how many retailers there are. We don't know how many books are actually being sold. The whole thing's a huge question mark, and a lot of people have just checked out of the scene altogether, and it's really sad. It really is very, very sad. And you could watch the decline in real time, which we did. We've been doing our channel. Well, we started our channel back in 2015. We kind of played around with things. We were doing gaming videos. We have a whole separate gaming channel, but we really didn't start ramping up our own content until about 2018. And that's really 2017, 2018. That's really when a lot of these journos and people associated with the mainstream comic book industry went hard against YouTubers and people trying to give objective comic book news outside the system, right? Well, I'm building up to something, right? I knew I said I wasn't going to do a video about, comic book journalists, and that's not dunking on people in particular, but I'm going to say here's another piece of the puzzle that's been revealed. This is Trey Wright stuff. Trey Massage Gun Kelly. Massage Gun Kelly, who reviewed comics for IGN 10 years ago. Interesting. Video games aren't my lane, right? But when I was reviewing comics for IGN about 10 years ago, we were in fact not allowed to give bad reviews. So this is probably in regards to IGN giving a 9 out of 10 or 90%, I think, to Hogwarts Legacy. A lot of more progressive video game sites have decided they're not going to review it at all. We had Wired put up a ridiculous non-review. It was just a activist blog hot take, giving it a 1 out of 10 because transphobia, right? Anyway, this peels back the layer a little bit more. And I've heard this from multiple people that a lot of comic book reviewers get comp copies to review for these big websites. Well, if you want to keep getting them, you're not going to talk shit about the publishers. You're not going to be objective. That's how the game is played. But I'm also like, comic books, relatively speaking, are pretty cheap. Like, I get game reviewers are hesitant to give negative reviews about games because the games are like $50 a piece. We're talking $3, $4, $5 comic books, digital comics, right? It doesn't really cost them anything. They're not even shipping you a physical copy in a lot of cases. And they're so afraid to lose that access, these reviewers, that everything's fantastic. And if you go out to a lot of these websites, everything is fantastic. Every comic book's great, or they give it a middling review, but they don't really shit on the book. Now, you get YouTubers out there that are actually ripping the shit out of a lot of the current books being published by Marvel and DC, and all of a sudden they're being called Nazis and whatever. I think what's actually going on is that these channels blew up, when people still gave a shit about Marvel and DC, but they blew up because of their honest opinions, regardless of whether or not you agree. People were just like, wow, somebody's actually, giving an honest opinion on this book. Now, are there people out there that just shit on everything because of where it came from or who wrote it or whatever? Yeah, probably, for sure. I guess, sure. But you can't sit there and say that these comic book websites all had all this journalistic integrity because they were going to review stuff fairly. In fact, I'm thinking back, even some of the websites I mentioned, they didn't review everything. They're very selective in what they reviewed. And a lot of times they would only review books that they knew they would like. They weren't going to review a book that they knew they were going to hate, because if they gave it an honest review and they gave it like a 3 out of 10, but that publisher was also, giving them ad money, what I'm saying? They're not gonna shit where they eat. And this is kind of the worst kept secret in fan journalism. This is why we can't really have truly objective fan journalists, because they are fans. They want access. They don't have the resources in a lot of cases to buy all the stuff to review it fairly. Now, we do own multiple websites. We do. And we actually have a Disney website too, piratesandprincesses.net. And I can tell you for a fact, on piratesandprincesses.net, we actually do buy all the stuff to review it, or our writers a lot of times will comp them for tickets, or we'll comp them for, depending on what it is and the circumstances. But I thought it was really weird when we had people out there saying, hey, we can't afford to pay you. And our writers get paid every week, right? We pay our writers every week because the stuff we write about actually brings views and actually brings in ad revenue. And I think the fundamental problem is the comic book industry, the Western comic book industry that these sites built their audiences for, has been whittled down to practically nothing, where it's not even sustainable, where at this point you've got to rely on people, a couple hundred people a month, throwing money into your Patreon jar just to be able to keep the site online. That's not sustainable. I think these sites, and I did mention it on Twitter, I said I think some of these sites could be made profitable. I think I could make them profitable. I'm going to be honest. I'm not just being, Mr. Arrogant or whatever. We've actually been running websites for a number of years. There are a number of sites that we've run that we've never talked about. We probably won't on YouTube because I don't want people going after them, because I know we have crazy people watch us. But we know how to monetize websites. And these are kind of niche websites. And there's certain things you got to do to monetize them, certain ads you got to run. You know what I'm saying? And there isn't I don't think a lot of business sense with a lot of the people running the fan comic book websites. You know, again, the fact that you have to rely on somebody giving you a free $3 comic book, you know, to be able to keep doing reviews. I'm like, to a normal business, that's a write-off. Like you buy a whole bunch of comic books every month and you pay for them because, you know, one, you can write it off because you're actually doing reviews on it. And two, you're going to make your money back on ad revenue or sponsorships or whatever, because the site actually generates traffic, like actual traffic. And these sites have basically destroyed their audiences. They've destroyed audience goodwill. So I'm going out there just trying to read about, you know, what's going on with comics journalism now. And yeah, a lot of people just are like, what the hell is going on? You know, I mean, we had, here we go. Gabe Hernandez. We did a video on this, comicbook.com admitting that webtoon and manga just completely destroyed the comic book industry, the mainstream comic book industry. Lots of other people having this conversation now. Makes you realize how much Wizard did a number on comics journalism. Great for artists and image, I guess. No, Wizard didn't destroy comics journalism. The comic book industry destroyed itself. The journalists actually helped with that. You know, they drove audiences away, in my opinion. Not everybody. I want to be clear, I'm not talking about everybody. Looks like honest comics journalism is finally calling out the phonies, Comic Perch and Wes from Thinking Critical and your boy Zach. Some great vids over the last day or so. That I would say is true. I saw Wes did a video, had Aaron Sparrow on, and they talked about a lot of the problems. But I'm looking at this from a purely financial issue, and I'm saying the audience is not sustainable. The audience isn't there. So, you know, where does comic book journalism go from here? I think it is going to be up to individual fans to probably take to social media to review stuff. Because apparently, you know, if the trade-off for getting free copies is that you can't be honest, then you can't trust a lot of these websites anyway, right? I mean, you really can't. I'm going down here to some of the replies. What you're saying is ethics in video game journalism should be called into question. That's actually true. Thanks for confirming it. Most reviews work that way. Games aren't going to be giving away, or game studios won't give away review codes to anyone who actually gives an honest review. That's not entirely true. We've gotten codes and we've gotten games that were mid, but yeah, you feel bad because they thought of you. You're like, here, have a $50 game. Oh, you hate that game? And you're going to give it a shit review? God, okay, so we won't call you a game. I know for a fact Marvel won't. If you say anything negative about Marvel, they will not give you anything. And we actually had this happen on Pirates and Princesses. We were actually on the Marvel list. And I don't know what we said or what we did, but all of a sudden we were no longer on the Marvel list. Not for comics, but for like movie releases and stuff like that. Now, weirdly enough, they did invite us to the premiere of Avatar 2, but they only gave us like 2 days notice to get there. And it was in LA and we couldn't even get a flight fast enough to get out there. But so we're not completely blacklisted. I just thought it was kind of weird, but yeah, it's how you got to roll, man. You got to, you know, this is why so many of these websites, and again, the companies they review, the companies they talk about, they get access to their people and they get ad revenue from these companies. They are not going to shit where they eat. And they're probably, have probably been given mandates even from on high to not shit where they eat. Because at the end of the day, it's about making money for these, especially the corporate owned sites, not about being honest, you know, but I think you can be honest. And what is this? Party Babies got a 7.5. Oh God. Yeah. So I think that, I think that, you know, we're kind of reaching the end of the line here for people relying on these websites to give fair reviews, whether it's for games or for, you know, whatever. And that's why people are going to social media. And, you know, a lot of times social media personalities do buy their own stuff. I would recommend going out and actually finding a site or people that buy their own stuff. Again, clownfishtv.com, whatever we review, if we're given a code or we're given access, we do make sure we disclaim it legally. You're supposed to say, hey, they sent us a code, or hey, they gave us a product to review. But we know a lot of sites won't do that, because then it's going to come out that like every damn thing that they talk about on the site has been bought and paid for by somebody else, right? So there we go. I'm going to wrap this one up. I just think it's really sad. I just think it's a sad situation. And I think it's even more sad that, like, you can't go out and buy a $3 or $4 comic book to review. You know, you're gonna do what they tell you to do. You're not gonna be honest because you don't want to stop getting your $3 or $4 comic books, right? All right, so I'm gonna wrap it up. Please subscribe for more pop culture news, views, and rants. We'll talk later.